For over a century, one powerful idea has gripped military leaders: the belief that wars can be won from the sky. The idea is that with enough bombs dropped on key targets, you can shatter any enemy's will to fight, wipe out their ability to resist, and win without the brutal, grinding cost of a ground war. It's a seductive promise, a cleaner, faster, more decisive way to wage war. But is it true? From the very first theories of air power, visionaries imagined fleets of bombers soaring past armies to strike directly at an enemy's heartland, its factories, its government, and its people. They believed that by inflicting enough pain and paralysis, they could force a nation to its knees. This doctrine was put to the ultimate test in the 20th century, a period defined by total war and terrifying aerial destruction. Today, we're going to analyze 4 of the most devastating bombing campaigns in history, from the firestorms of Germany to the jungles of Vietnam, to find out if dropping bombs has ever really been the thing that wins a war. We'll cut through the theory and look at the stark, often contradictory reality of what happens when the bombs start to fall. The big ideas behind strategic bombing were actually laid out long before the technology fully existed. Theorists like Italy's Giulio Douhet and America's Billy Mitchell argued that air power was an offensive weapon, destined to make future wars a battle of national will. They imagined that bombers would always get through, and by targeting industrial hubs and terrorizing civilians, they could cause a complete societal collapse that would force a government to surrender. War would no longer be a clash of armies on some distant front. It would be a direct assault on the nation itself. World War II in Europe became the first massive laboratory for these terrifying ideas. And the first major test didn't come from the Allies, but from the German Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. From 1940 to 1941, German bombers hammered British cities, with London getting hit for 57 consecutive nights. The goal was simple: destroy Britain's ability to fight and break the spirit of its people. The physical damage was immense. Over 43,000 British civilians were killed, and nearly 1.5 million homes were damaged or destroyed. Yet, right away, the theory started to show cracks. British war production, while disrupted at first, didn't collapse. In fact, it often went up as factories were moved and the workforce mobilized with even greater urgency. More importantly, the psychological goal was a catastrophic failure. Instead of shattering morale, the Blitz created a sense of collective defiance, a spirit that came to be known as the Blitz spirit. The shared suffering and anger didn't turn the British people against their government. It hardened their resolve to resist. The raids that were supposed to be a knockout blow instead solidified Britain's will to fight. When the tide of the air war turned, the Allies embraced strategic bombing on a scale that dwarfed the Blitz. The British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces unleashed a combined bomber offensive against Germany that would last for years. Their strategies, though, were different. The RAF, having seen how hard it was to hit specific targets at night, adopted a policy of area bombing. Led by Air Chief Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris, the explicit goal was to destroy entire cities, not just factories, to dehouse the German workforce and break civilian morale with sheer terror. The USAAF, on the other hand, held on to the pre-war idea of precision daylight bombing. They believed their heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses could fight their way through German defenses and destroy key choke points in the German war economy. The result was a relentless round-the-clock assault. The Americans hit by day, the British by night. From 1940 to 1945, Allied forces dropped a staggering 1.4 million tons of bombs on Germany. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin were turned into infernos. The 1943 Hamburg raids, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, created a firestorm that killed an estimated 42,600 people and leveled 60% of the city. The bombing of Dresden in the war's final months remains one of the most controversial acts of the entire conflict, unleashing a firestorm that killed around 25,000 people for very little clear strategic gain. The cost to the Allies was horrific. Bomber Command alone lost over 55,000 aircrew, with only 24% of aircrew surviving the war without being killed or wounded. The American 8th Air Force also suffered huge casualties, especially in 1943, before long-range fighter escorts were available. So, was all this sacrifice and destruction worth it? Did it actually win the war? The data tells a complicated story. Post-war analysis, especially the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, yielded some surprising answers. The survey concluded that while the bombing caused incredible destruction, it didn't paralyze Germany's war economy the way the theorists had hoped. In fact, German aircraft production actually peaked in 1944, the very year the Allied bombing was at its most intense. Through amazing feats of dispersal, camouflage, and round-the-clock repair, German industry proved incredibly resilient. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, figured that bombing only reduced industrial production by about 20 to 30%. A big hit, but a long way from a knockout blow. The campaign became most effective in the final year of the war, when it shifted from destroying cities to targeting critical industries. Attacks on Germany's synthetic oil plants cut output by over 90% by late 1944, starving the German military of fuel. In the same way, focused attacks on the transportation network created massive bottlenecks that crippled the movement of troops and supplies. These precision strikes had a much bigger impact on Germany's ability to fight than the firebombing of its cities. The USSBS found that while bombing did cause widespread fear and defeatism, it didn't lead to an open revolt against the Nazi regime. Instead, much of the German population's anger was directed at the Allies. The state's totalitarian control made sure that any dissent was crushed before it could grow into real resistance. Ultimately, the strategic bombing campaign in Europe was a critical part of the Allied victory, but it wasn't the single decisive factor. It forced Germany to pull enormous resources, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tons of anti-aircraft guns, and most of its fighter planes, to defend its homeland. This fatally weakened the German war machine on the eastern and western fronts, where the war was ultimately won by boots on the ground. The bombers inflicted terrible damage, but it still took the Red Army storming Berlin and the Western Allies crossing the Rhine to force the final surrender. In the Pacific, the doctrine of strategic bombing evolved into its most destructive form. After a long and bloody island-hopping campaign, the United States was finally within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The new B-29 superfortress, a technological marvel that could fly higher, faster, and with a heavier bomb load than any plane before it, was the chosen instrument for this final aerial assault. At first, the USAAF tried the same high-altitude daylight precision strategy it had used over Germany, but it failed fast. The jet stream over Japan was much stronger than expected, throwing bombs wildly off target. Plus, Japanese industry wasn't concentrated in large, obvious factories. It was spread out across thousands of small workshops, many of them operating out of residential neighborhoods. A new, more brutal strategy was needed. The man who came up with it was General Curtis LeMay. Taking command, LeMay made a radical call. He ordered his B-29s stripped of their defensive guns to carry more bombs and told them to attack at night, at low altitudes, using incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The target was no longer a specific factory, it was the cities themselves. Since Japanese cities were built mostly of wood and paper, the goal was to create uncontrollable firestorms. The first test came on the night of March 9, 1945, against Tokyo. In one raid, hundreds of B-29s dropped thousands of tons of incendiaries, creating a sea of fire that was visible for over 150 miles. The inferno was so intense, it created its own weather system. An estimated 100,000 people were killed, more than died in the initial blast of either atomic bomb, and 16 square miles of the capital were burned to the ground. Over the next 5 months, this scene was repeated across Japan. More than 60 Japanese cities were firebombed, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and leaving millions homeless. It was a campaign of annihilation. By the summer of 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless. Its navy was at the bottom of the sea. Its supply ships had been sunk by American submarines. Its cities were burning, and a naval blockade was slowly starving the country. Still, the military leadership refused to surrender. It was in this context that the world's first atomic bombs were used. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. The blast and firestorm killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly and destroyed nearly 70% of the city. Even after this, the Japanese government didn't surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 people on impact. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito, in a landmark radio address, announced Japan's surrender, specifically mentioning the new and most cruel bomb as a reason to end the war. This has cemented the traditional view in history. The atomic bombs were the knockout blow that ended the war and avoided a costly US invasion. But for decades, a fierce debate among historians has challenged this. The revisionist school of thought argues Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and that another massive event on August 9th was the real trigger, the Soviet Union's declaration of war. Throughout 1945, a peace faction in the Japanese government had been secretly trying to get the neutral Soviet Union to mediate a deal. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 9th shattered that last hope. Japan now faced a two-front war against two superpowers. Revisionist historians argue the Soviet invasion was the true strategic nightmare for Japan's leaders. They were willing to sacrifice millions fighting the Americans. But the idea of a Soviet invasion and potential communist occupation was unthinkable. The atomic bombs in this view became a convenient excuse. It was less humiliating to say they were defeated by a miracle weapon than to admit their entire strategy had failed and they'd been outmaneuvered. So, were the bombs decisive? The truth is probably a mix of everything. The firebombing had already crippled the country. The blockade was squeezing it to death. The Soviet invasion removed the last diplomatic option, and the atomic bombs provided both a profound shock and a politically acceptable reason for the emperor to step in and force a surrender. To say the bombs alone won the war ignores the bigger picture. They were the final, terrible blows in a war that was already nearing its end, but they weren't the sole cause. If you're finding this deep dive into military history engaging, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon. We release in-depth videos like this regularly, and your support helps us continue to bring these complex stories to light. 2 decades later, the United States found itself in a totally different kind of war in the jungles of Southeast Asia. In Vietnam, the opponent wasn't a centralized industrial state like Germany or Japan. It was a determined guerrilla insurgency in the south, backed by the pre-industrial agrarian state of North Vietnam. Despite this huge difference, American military leaders once again put their faith in the bomber. The main air campaign, Operation Rolling Thunder, kicked off in March 1965. The goals were to boost morale in South Vietnam, pressure North Vietnam to stop supporting the Viet Cong, and destroy their transportation and industrial capacity. What followed was the most intense and sustained bombing campaign in human history. Over 3.5 years, the US dropped 864,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. To put that in perspective, that's more tonnage than was dropped in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. B-52s, originally designed to drop nuclear bombs, were repurposed to drop immense quantities of conventional explosives on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and targets in the north. General LeMay, the architect of Japan's firebombing, famously said the US should bomb the North Vietnamese back to the Stone Age. But the strategy failed, spectacularly. Why? First, there just weren't many strategic targets to hit. North Vietnam wasn't a modern, industrialized nation. Destroying its few factories did little to cripple its ability to fight, since most of its war supplies came from China and the Soviet Union. Second, the main supply route, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, wasn't a highway you could just cut. It was a complex, ever-changing web of jungle paths, tunnels and river crossings, stretching for thousands of miles. Bombing could disrupt parts of the trail, but it couldn't shut it down. An army of over 300,000 workers, often using just shovels and bicycles, worked tirelessly to repair the damage. For every crater the Americans made, the North Vietnamese would repair it or build a detour, often overnight. Third, and most importantly, the bombing had the exact opposite psychological effect that was intended. Just like in Britain during the Blitz, the constant bombardment didn't break the will of the North Vietnamese people. It hardened it. The air war became a powerful recruiting tool for the communists, unifying the population against a foreign enemy and strengthening their resolve to fight on, no matter the cost. Rolling Thunder was quietly stopped in 1968, having failed on all of its strategic goals. But the bombing wasn't over. In 1972, President Nixon launched Operation Linebacker 1 and the even more intense Linebacker 2, known as the Christmas bombings. These campaigns were different. Using new precision-guided smart bombs, Linebacker was far more effective at destroying specific targets. Linebacker 2, an 11-day all-out B-52 assault on Hanoi and Haiphong, was designed to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. Supporters argue that Linebacker 2 worked, claiming it was the final blow that led to the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. Critics, however, argue that the final deal wasn't much different from what was on the table months before. More importantly, the bombing didn't change the war's final outcome. 2 years after the last American combat troops left, North Vietnam launched its final offensive, and South Vietnam collapsed. The Vietnam War is a stark lesson in the limits of air power. It showed that dropping millions of tons of bombs can't defeat a determined enemy who has no conventional targets and is willing to absorb incredible punishment for their cause. You cannot bomb an idea. The failures in Vietnam and the massive collateral damage of World War II spurred a technological revolution. The goal was to finally achieve that original dream of precision, to destroy one target with one weapon, minimizing risk to everyone. This led to the development of precision-guided munitions, PGMs, or smart bombs. The first big showcase for this new era was the 1991 Gulf War. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, a US-led coalition unleashed a devastating air campaign called Operation Desert Storm. The war was on TV, and the world watched grainy black and white footage of laser-guided bombs flying down air shafts and hitting targets with pinpoint accuracy. The results seemed revolutionary. Stealth aircraft like the F-117 systematically dismantled Iraq's command and control, air defenses and infrastructure with what looked like surgical precision. Air power, it was said, had finally come of age, paving the way for a ground campaign that lasted only 100 hours. But the narrative of a clean push-button war wasn't the whole story. While smart bombs made up only about 7% of the total munitions used, their strategic impact was huge. Still, the victory wasn't won by air power alone. It was the combination of the air campaign paralyzing the Iraqi military, followed by a massive ground invasion by 500,000 troops, that ultimately liberated Kuwait. A few years later, in 1999, came what many see as the purest example of a war won by air power: the NATO intervention in Kosovo. For 78 days, NATO planes bombed Serbian forces to stop a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Crucially, there was no ground invasion. After nearly 3 months of bombing, Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic gave in and withdrew his forces. On the surface, Kosovo looks like the ultimate proof. But here too, the context is critical. The bombing was often ineffective at stopping the small, mobile paramilitary units from doing the actual killing. The victory was also the result of major diplomatic pressure, especially from Russia, and the very real threat of a NATO ground invasion if the air war failed. It was a unique mix of pressures that got the job done, not just the bombs. Conflicts in Afghanistan and the Second Iraq War have reinforced this lesson. Air power, now dominated by precision weapons and drones, is incredibly good at destroying targets and supporting troops on the ground. But against insurgencies and non-state actors, it can't achieve a political victory on its own. The Taliban was quickly knocked from power in Afghanistan in 2001 by a mix of special forces and overwhelming air power, but they were never truly defeated, returning to power 20 years later. In Iraq, a swift shock and awe campaign in 2003 was followed by a long, bloody insurgency that air power was not equipped to handle. The modern era has shown that precision bombing is a powerful tool. It can cripple an enemy's military and save the lives of friendly troops. But it hasn't changed the fundamental nature of war. It can't, by itself, hold territory, change minds, or build a lasting peace. So, does bombing actually work? Let's go back to our initial question. After looking at a century of air warfare, from the firestorms of Hamburg to the smart bombs of Baghdad, the answer is a clear and resounding, rarely on its own. History shows that strategic bombing has been a powerful weapon. It has successfully wrecked an enemy's ability to fight, as it did against Germany's fuel supply. It has delivered profound psychological shocks that helped push for a final surrender, as was the case with the atomic bombs in Japan. And in very specific political situations like Kosovo, it has been the main tool that, combined with other pressures, achieved a political goal. But that original dream of the air power theorists, that bombers alone could force a nation to its knees, has consistently proven to be a dangerous fantasy. Bombing civilians in Britain, Germany, and North Vietnam didn't break the public's will. It often strengthened it, breeding defiance in the face of destruction. Victory in major wars like World War II wasn't won until boots were on the ground to take and hold territory. And against enemies driven by ideology instead of industry, like in Vietnam and Afghanistan, air power has shown its profound limits. The switch to precision weapons has made bombing a more effective and less brutal tool, but it's not a silver bullet. It can shape the battlefield and help achieve victory, but it can't replace a complete strategy that weaves together military, political, and diplomatic efforts. The promise of a quick, clean victory from 30,000 feet remains what it has always been: a seductive, but ultimately elusive fantasy. War, ultimately, is still a human endeavor, fought and won not just by machines in the sky, but by the will of those on the ground. We've got more in-depth history videos coming regularly, so let us know in the comments what you'd like to see next.